A quiet, mist-shrouded morning in Maplewood, a small town where everyone knows everyone, is suddenly broken by a scene no one can forget. John Miller, a soldier freshly returned from service, is thrown out of a bustling local diner. The reason? Not because he started a fight, not because he caused trouble, but because, somehow, his uniform, his tired eyes, and the burdens he carried weren't welcome anymore. For John, this moment felt like a betrayal. He had given nearly a decade of his life to serving a country that promised honor, belonging, and gratitude. Yet here he was, in the heart of the town he had long called home, treated like a pariah. That night, John stood on the edge of Maplewood's quiet streets, wondering if he still belonged. Was this the price of service? To return from war only to be treated like a ghost? But within this sting of rejection came a spark, a question that refused to fade. Could one man stand up and make a difference? Could one voice challenge a town to rediscover its heart? What unfolds is more than a story of a veteran and a diner. It's the story of a town grappling with its own identity, a soldier searching for belonging, and a quiet revolution that reminds an entire community what honor truly means. From the sting of discrimination to the warmth of belonging, from silence to a rallying cry for change, John's journey becomes Maplewood's journey. A story of belonging, a story of sacrifice, a story of resilience and the strength to stand tall when thrown down. This is the story of John Miller and how a soldier kicked out of a diner inspired an entire town to remember its heart. The crisp air of Maplewood in late summer felt foreign to John Miller as he stepped out of the taxi. The sun sank low over the quiet streets lined with mom and pop shops and a handful of cars parked along the curb. To any passerby, he looked like a man simply returning home, a tall, broad-shouldered veteran with a stern but tired gaze, a worn duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Yet inside, John felt like a visitor in a world that no longer fit. Sarah, his wife of 10 years, waved from across the sidewalk, a shy smile lighting her face. "Hey, soldier," she called, brushing a strand of brown hair out of her eyes. "Welcome home." The sight of her was like a beacon, a reminder that despite all he had witnessed and endured, she was still here, waiting for him. "Hey, Sarah." John smiled faintly, dropping the bag and closing the distance between them. He pulled her into a tight hug, burying his nose in the familiar scent of her hair. The tension in his chest ebbed, if only for a moment. "Are you hungry?" she asked softly, brushing a hand down the side of his stubbled jaw. "I thought we could go to Marcus's diner tonight." "It's still as popular as ever." John shrugged. "Sure. Let's go." The walk to the diner was quiet. The hum of traffic and the faint sound of crickets blended into a low, soothing hum. Yet every noise felt sharp in John's ears. The clang of a metal sign swinging in the wind. The sound of a car door slamming a block away. His senses were still tuned to a place far from Maplewood. As they pushed open the door to the diner, a bell announced their arrival. The place was bustling. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and a long counter was crowded with patrons. The smell of grease and fresh coffee was overwhelming. Sarah waved at the staff, then led John to a booth near the window. "Same spot as always," she said, smiling. John sank down and looked around. The room felt too bright, too loud. The sound of laughter felt sharp, intrusive, He clenched and unclenched his hands under the table. "Hey, John," came a voice from behind the counter. It was Eddie, one of the younger waiters. "Welcome home, man." He offered a shy wave. John gave a stiff nod, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Eddie." Sarah placed a hand over John's. "We'll order your favorite, okay? Just relax." "Right," he replied, brushing a finger across the worn surface of the table. Moments later, Marcus, the owner of the diner, emerged from the kitchen. A tall man in his late 50s, with graying hair and a sharp nose, he spotted John and waved. "Well, well, John Miller. Back from the army, eh?" "Yep." John nodded quietly. Marcus gave a tight smile, brushing a hand down his apron. "Good for you. Must be some stories, huh?" "Yeah," John said quietly. "Some stories." Marcus didn't stay long. He gave a brief glance and walked towards another table. To John, it felt like the glance lingered too long, weighed down with some unspoken judgment. He tightened his grip on the edge of the table, but said nothing. The trouble started when John rose to wash his hands. As he passed a table of younger patrons, college kids, laughing too loud, one of them bumped into him. The boy waved a lazy hand and sneered. "Watch where you're going, old man." John froze. Suddenly, he was no longer in Maplewood. The sound of a boy's voice became the sound of a rifle chamber being pulled. The laughter became the crack of gunfire. The room spun. Sarah's voice cut through the fog. He drew in a long, slow breath, brushing past the boy. "Sorry," he said quietly, and kept walking. But the boy didn't let it go. "What, you two messed up from the war?" he called out, grinning to his friends. The words felt like a slap across John's spine. He stopped mid-step. The room hushed. He turned slowly, meeting the boy's gaze. "What did you just say?" The boy shrugged, smirking. "I said, maybe you're too messed up from the war." For a moment, John felt like he was back in the mountains of Afghanistan, adrenaline burning through his veins. The boy flinched as John took a step closer, fists clenched. "John, no." Sarah rose from the booth, grabbing his arm. He exhaled sharply, shaking himself free from the mist of memories, forcing the soldier in him to stand down. "Forget it," he said hoarsely. "Not worth it." But before he could turn, Marcus was suddenly beside them, a stern look on his lined face. "That's enough, John," he said sharply. "I don't want any trouble in my diner. You understand? Me?" "I didn't," John started, voice rising. "Just take it outside." Marcus waved a hand dismissively, like John was some drunk causing a scene. "You've had enough for tonight." John felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. "Enough?" he said slowly. "I just came here to have a meal with my wife." "He's the one." Marcus refused to meet his gaze. "Go, John. We don't want any trouble." "Not tonight." Sarah stepped closer, voice shaking. "Marcus, this is John. He fought for this country. He didn't do anything wrong." Marcus refused to respond. Instead, he waved towards the door. "Just go, John. This is my place." "You're scaring the other customers." "Scaring," John repeated, voice shaking. The room felt too small. The hum of the air conditioning became a scream. The low buzz of conversation felt like 1,000 whispers. "I didn't do a thing," he said, voice rising now. "I didn't do a thing." "John," Sarah whispered, tugging at his hand. "Let's just go, okay?" The boy in the corner smirked as John passed, brushing too close. The sound of that smirk felt like a rifle shot. John clenched a fist, but didn't swing. Instead, he pulled open the door, the sound of the bell ringing like a death knell. Outside, under the waning twilight, John sank down on the curb. The sound of the door closing felt like a barricade slamming shut. He pressed a hand to his chest, breathing hard. Sarah emerged a moment later, brushing a hand down his shoulder. "I'm sorry, John. This isn't right." John shook his head slowly, swallowing down the sting rising in his throat. I gave everything for this place," he said quietly. "And tonight, I don't even belong in it." Sarah sank down beside him, brushing her hand across his. They sat there in silence, the sound of Maplewood drifting around them, until the night was deep and the sting had dulled to a low ache. The morning after the incident felt like a hangover for Maplewood. The quiet streets, lined with old buildings and freshly swept sidewalks, held a tension that hadn't been there before. What had happened at Marcus's diner circulated quickly. A whispered piece of gossip passed from mouth to mouth until it became a headline no one could ignore. At Lucy Carter's desk in the cramped newsroom of the Maplewood Times, the veteran reporter tapped a pencil against the edge of a notepad, frowning. She had been covering Maplewood stories for 10 years, and this felt like more than just a scuffle between a veteran and a restaurateur. "Sarah called," said Lucy to the editor. Apparently John Miller was thrown out for doing absolutely nothing. Her editor, a gruff man named Dan, shrugged. "People have a right to run their businesses as they like." "Might be a," he said. She said, "thing." Lucy sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Maybe, but John Miller is a veteran. Just came back from serving in Afghanistan. Shouldn't we be digging into that?" Dan grumbled, but waved a hand dismissively. "Do your thing, Lucy. Just make sure it's worth printing." Meanwhile, at John and Sarah's tiny rental home, morning came slowly. The air was still, and John stood by the window, looking out over the mist rising from the fields beyond town. Sarah came to him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "People don't know what you've been through, John. They don't understand." He gave a bitter smile. "Seems like no one wants to." "Not anymore." Sarah pressed herself against him, brushing a hand down the muscles of his arm. "Then we make them understand. You don't have to accept this, John. You didn't spend 10 years fighting for a place that doesn't respect you." He nodded slowly, not with anger anymore, but a quiet, grim resolve. Word spread quickly through the veteran community in Maplewood. At a quiet breakfast spot called Mary Ellen's Cafe, a group of retired service members gathered. Among them was Chris Taylor, John's best friend from the Army. The two had served together in Kandahar and knew the sting of war in ways that few others in Maplewood would comprehend. Chris clenched his jaw when he heard the news. "That's John Miller we're talking about. You're telling me he was thrown out like some troublemaker?" The room grew quiet. An older veteran, Tom Sanders, tapped the brim of his old Army cap. "That boy gave more for this town than most can imagine. Might be time this town remembers that." Chris nodded sharply. "Then we make sure it doesn't happen again." Sarah received a call later that morning. It was Lucy Carter. "Sarah, I want to cover this story. Will John speak with me?" Sarah glanced towards John, brushing a hand down the phone. "He might, Lucy. He doesn't want sympathy. He just doesn't want to be treated like a threat for wearing the uniform. Lucy smiled quietly. That's the story that needs telling, Sarah. Not the scene at the diner, but the man behind it. Will you ask him? That afternoon, John and Lucy met in the quiet park by the town's war monument. Lucy's questions were gentle, open. John spoke slowly, voice shaking as he recalled moments from his service, moments when a younger boy from Maplewood learned to carry a rifle and bear the weight of another man's life. People don't owe me thanks every day, John said quietly, brushing a hand down the weathered plaque that bore the names of fallen soldiers. But I don't deserve to be thrown out like I was some criminal. Not here. Not in the town I called home. Lucy pressed stop on the recorder and looked at John. That's the story people need to read, she said quietly. The article appeared 3 days later. Its headline read, "A son of Maplewood returns, only to be kicked out. John Miller served his country. Will Maplewood stand by him?" People began talking openly. At the post office, at the gas station, in lines at the bank. John didn't seek pity, didn't campaign for support, but the quiet strength of the man resonated throughout the town. Chris and a group of veterans visited the diner. They weren't there for a scene, but to ask questions. Why was John thrown out? What did he do? Marcus refused to answer at first, brushing a hand down the apron he had worn for 20 years. But the room was quiet, and every veteran there wore the same hard, questioning gaze. "He caused a scene," he said gruffly. "Customers felt unsafe." Chris shook his head slowly. "Customers? You mean one boy making a snide comment?" Marcus shrugged, unable to justify. The silence weighed heavily. "John's no threat to this town," said an older veteran from the group. "We came here tonight to ask one thing. Will Maplewood stand for a man who served?" For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Meanwhile, Lucy's article circulated online and across Maplewood. Sarah received flowers one morning from a neighbor she hadn't spoken to in years. An older woman waved as John passed, her hand resting over her heart. Slowly, Maplewood began to shift. What started as a moment of exclusion became a rallying point for belonging. That evening, at the Veterans Lodge, John stood quietly with a beer in hand. The room was filled with friends, old and new, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Not because of a uniform or a medal, but because of the quiet respect that came from knowing your worth and standing your ground. Sarah watched from across the room, brushing a hand down the soft swell of emotion rising in her chest. John caught her eye and smiled a rare, genuine smile. The morning mist still lingered over Maplewood when John stepped out of the small veterans' lodge, brushing a hand down the weathered rail. The night before felt like a rare respite surrounded by friends and comrades. He felt a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Yet deep down, the sting remained, the question burning quietly within him. Should he let this go, or should he stand up and demand accountability? Sarah noticed him standing there when she came out with a cup of hot coffee. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. John shrugged, brushing a hand down the side of the cup. "I don't want to cause trouble. I didn't come home for a fight. But I also didn't come home to be treated like some pariah." Sarah laid a hand over his. "Then don't walk away from this, John. This town needs to understand. Not for you only, but for every veteran that's felt this sting." Let this be about more than a moment in a diner. Let this be about belonging, about honor. He met her gaze and gave a slow nod. Word had already circulated throughout Maplewood that John was considering making a formal complaint about the incident at Marcus's diner. Lucy Carter announced in that morning's edition of the Maplewood Times, "John Miller will speak out. Will Maplewood listen?" The veteran refused to accept an apology behind closed doors. The question now, will Maplewood stand by its sons and daughters who have served? That headline shook Maplewood harder than the first article. The mayor, David Coleman, called an emergency meeting at the town hall. Business owners came, veterans came, and ordinary citizens came too, some out of loyalty, some out of guilt, some out of curiosity. The room was packed. John stood quietly in the back, hands crossed, looking every bit like the soldier he had been trained to be. But tonight was about words, about making a stand that would carry weight beyond the walls of the town hall. Sarah, Lucy, and Chris sat beside him. At the front of the room, Mayor Coleman called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to address an incident that has divided our town. Mr. John Miller, a veteran of the United States Army, has brought forth a complaint about an interaction that occurred at Marcus's diner." He glanced down, brushing a hand across the table. "We must ask ourselves, what kind of town are we? Will we accept that those who served this country be treated like outsiders?" John stepped forward slowly, brushing down the edge of his shirt, voice deep and quiet. "I didn't come here tonight to cause trouble," he said, looking out across the room. "I came here because I owe it to myself and to every veteran to make sure we have a place where we belong. Not as outsiders, not as burdens, not as threats, but as neighbors, friends, and family." The room fell silent. He spoke openly about the night at the diner, not about the boy or about Marcus, but about how it felt to be treated as a threat, as an unwelcome guest in the very town he had sacrificed so much for. "I can take a lot of things," he said, voice wavering slightly. "I can take the sound of a rifle cracking over my head. I can take long nights and empty meals. But I can't take the thought that when I came home to Maplewood, the place I called home no longer wanted me." Several people wiped at their eyes. Others shook their heads slowly. In that moment, John Miller became more than a veteran with a complaint. He became a symbol for every person in that room who felt misunderstood, overlooked, or discarded. Sarah rose to stand beside him, brushing her hand down the side of his arm. "This isn't about one night in a diner," she said firmly. "This is about making Maplewood a place where every person feels seen, heard, and respected. We owe that to John, and we owe that to ourselves." Chris stepped forward too, brushing a hand down the brim of his veteran's cap. "My name's Chris Taylor. I served with John. I watched him put himself in harm's way so that every person in this room can walk down the streets of this town safe and free. What we're asking tonight is simple. Will Maplewood stand by its heroes, or will it turn its back?" A long silence followed. The mayor spoke quietly. "We owe John an apology, not just for what happened that night, but for every moment he felt unseen or unwanted. As mayor, I am proposing a formal statement of apology from the town and a review of how we support and honor our veteran community. Will the council support this?" One by one, the council members stood and said, "Aye." Then came the sound that would carry this night into Maplewood history. Applause. Not a polite clap or a subdued hand gesture, but a rising, swelling sound that shook the walls. John stood in its center, eyes glistening, not because he wanted a victory, but because tonight he felt, for the first time in a long time, that he truly belonged. Sarah pressed herself closer to him, brushing away a lone tear from the corner of his eye. Lucy, standing to the side, smiled faintly as she captured the scene for tomorrow's headline. In the days that followed, changes came quietly. The sign at the diner announced its new veteran discount, and John was invited to come and have a cup of coffee on the house. Not as a guest, but as an honored member of the Maplewood family. The boy who had sneered was later spotted shaking John's hand, looking down and mumbling an apology. Sarah watched as John walked down the Maplewood streets with his head held a little higher, not because he had demanded respect, but because respect had found its way back to him. That night, as he and Sarah stood on their porch, the stars winked quietly overhead. "Thank you," John said softly, brushing a hand down her hair. Sarah smiled. "For what?" "For reminding me that this place is worth fighting for. Not just with a rifle, but with words. With heart." She rested her head against his chest. "You gave a lot for this town, John. It was only right that it gave a little back." The morning sun bathed Maplewood in gold as John stood by the porch of the Veterans Lodge. The quiet hum of this small town felt different now, warmer, accepting, hopeful. What had started with an ugly moment had evolved into a pivotal chapter for Maplewood and for John Miller. Sarah emerged from the lodge with 2 cups of steaming coffee. "The mayor called again," she said, brushing a hand down John's back. "He wants to make sure you're coming tonight." John smiled faintly. "The opening ceremony for the Veteran Resource Center?" "Of course." He shook his head in wonder. "Can you believe this started because I was thrown out of a diner?" Sarah smiled and pressed herself closer. "That's how change works sometimes, John. It only takes one person standing up, one moment of saying no more, and suddenly a town finds its heart." That evening, Maplewood came alive for the opening of the Veterans Resource and Welcome Center. The old library had been transformed into a warm space for veterans and their families, a place where they could find support, resources, and belonging. The room was packed with smiling faces. The mayor stood beside John, brushing down his suit jacket before approaching the microphone. "Today we honor those who have served, not just with words, but with action. The Veterans Resource and Welcome Center will be a beacon for all those returning home, a place where service is met with gratitude, belonging, and support. And none of this would have been possible if John Miller hadn't had the courage to stand up when he was mistreated." A wave of applause rolled through the room as John stepped forward. He brushed down the front of his shirt, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. "Thank you," he began quietly, voice strong and clear. "I didn't want this fight. All I wanted was a place where I felt like I belonged. All any veteran wants are a chance to come home and live in peace. But when I was thrown out of that diner, I felt like the uniform I wore meant nothing, like all those years meant nothing. Today, looking out at all of you, I can tell you this means more than words can say. We built this center for every veteran who felt lost, every person who felt overlooked, every soldier searching for belonging. Not just because it's right, but because it makes Maplewood a better place for all of us." Thank you for standing with me, for reminding me what it means to come home. Sarah wiped at the corners of her eyes as John stepped down from the podium. The room rose in applause, not for a veteran, not for a soldier, but for a man who refused to stay down when thrown out. Chris wrapped an arm around John's shoulders. Proud of you, brother. We came home for moments like this. John smiled, brushing a hand down the brim of Chris's old veteran's cap. We came home for moments like this. And moments like this make every hard step worth it. As the evening waned, John and Sarah stood hand in hand, looking out at the bustling room. What had started as a bitter chapter in their story had become a hopeful new beginning, a chapter for Maplewood, for its veterans, and for every person seeking belonging and understanding. Sarah smiled, brushing a hand down John's chest. You started this for yourself, John, but you gave this town a reason to be better. You gave it a heart. John pulled her closer, brushing a kiss across the top of her head. We gave it a heart. Together. Outro. And so, the soldier who was thrown out of a small town diner became the reason Maplewood learned to open its doors. Not with indifference or suspicion, but with warmth, understanding, and belonging. John Miller came home to a town that, for a moment, forgot what belonging meant, and then he reminded it. He reminded Maplewood that every person has worth, every veteran deserves respect, and every voice can create change. In the end, John didn't just win a fight for himself. He sparked a movement that reshaped Maplewood for generations to come. In doing so, he came home, in the truest sense, a hero embraced by the heart of a town that finally learned how to stand with its own.